Hi, my name is Dr. Chinny, and my talk or session is focused on a discussion or possibly an explanation on the process of undertaking a professional or work-based project. And this is within the context of an academic degree qualification. So in terms of context, what is driving my talk or session is the number of uncertainties or the challenges in terms of the current global economic climate. This has meant that businesses, individuals are sort of taking steps back and questioning, do business continue as usual? Or do we review our current offerings? Are there things we need to change in terms of project, in terms of targets? In terms of objectives of my session, I've got 4 objectives. The first one is for you to get to review or perhaps get to know the key stages of a work-based project and essentially to develop an awareness on how to make ethical and evidence-based decisions. I have underlined my third bullet point because I consider it as my key objective, and that is for delegates, for you to gain good understanding on how to adequately navigate your own sustainability strategy. You will get to do this by reviewing your implementation plan for the purpose of that work-based project, your communication strategies, and of course, your monitoring tactics. So what I would encourage you to do is to actively reflect on your own work practice. Reflect on the experiences that you currently have and consider how things compare with what you have as tools and techniques within your organization in the context on how to adequately measure what contribution your project, your workforce project would have on improving your business practice. Right, I think it makes sense for us to have some understanding on what I mean by a work-based project. Now, this could be an endeavor you embark on. It could be a task that you've got to do within your organization, or in this respect, it could just be a project. So, which means it's got to be something that's got clearly defined purpose. It's got to have targets associated with that task, with that endeavor, and it's got to be within specific strategies. Now, in terms of the key stages of a work-based project, I've used the term key stages of a clear work-based project, and I've termed this the 4 Ds. I've got the define stage, the design stage, the delegate stage, and the deliver stage. Now, some people could use different terminologies. For example, someone could say the define stage of the project is the initiation stage. The design stage could be classed as the planning stage. The delegation stage is the execution stage. And finally, the deliver stage is the monitoring and evaluation stage. So we'll take each of these stages one after the other. Okay, starting with the define stage, which is the first stage of the work-based project. This is where you have the context and the rationale of the work-based project. So essentially, it is at this stage of the project that you get to convince someone else why what you want to do is relevant or important for the organization under consideration. I've got 3 things I'm going to shed some light on within the stage. The first one is the issue of interest. So what is that area that you have identified to focus on for the project? The second thing I'll touch on the define stage is your organization's structure. So this has got to be taken into consideration while you're thinking about that issue you have identified to focus on. And I would also talk about the solution, the benefit, or the success of that project. So while you have identified an issue or area of focus, you've got to also think about what are the benefits or what are the success strategies that are associated with this area of focus. Right. So in terms of the area of interest, to help you build a strong rationale, I've put down a number of questions that could serve as trigger points for you. Now, it could be where you're asking questions around what are the key priorities of your organization's current strategy. Now, when I say current strategy, you could or you should actually be taking into consideration the current economic climate. You could also take into consideration the aftermath of the global pandemic. Okay, so there are a number of things that would have or currently having an impact on your organization's strategy. So asking questions like what are the key priorities will help you identify a strong or build a strong rationale within the context of your area of interest. Another question you could possibly ask in terms of building that strong rationale could be, what are the management's current focus points? Okay, so this is also in line with the current strategy. Now, a simpler question to ask could be, what are the potential problems that your organization is facing? What are potential issues that your organization is facing? Or what opportunities can you see for your organization? That could serve as an opportunity for you to build a strong rationale for that area of interest. Now, having identified that area of interest and build some sort of rationale, the next point or stage is where you're beginning to justify why that area of interest is relevant. And this is where evidence comes in. I've used the term evidence-based approach. Now, evidence could be where you look at competitors, how competitors within your area of organizational focus, how they are doing or how they are faring. Evidence could be your organization's current and previous annual reports. Now, something else in terms of evidence that shouldn't be forgotten is your organization's culture, and I'll touch on this just a little later. So, which means as you're building the strong rationale, you've got to ensure that your rationale is not just based on your viewpoint. It's got to be supported with evidence. Right, still on the point on building a strong rationale for your area of interest, and then bringing in the concept of the culture or your organization's structure. Gaining good understanding or reviewing your level of understanding in terms of your organization's culture is absolutely essential, because you've got to take into consideration, when I say culture, you've got to take into consideration the core value of that organization. So that has got to be one of the things that is driving that your area of interest. You've got to take into consideration the vision of the organization. So where the organization is going. The core value is who the organization is. And then the third point in terms of culture is the mission of that organization. So how they intend to get to where they're going. So these 3 points or these 3 elements of culture has got to be something that you know and you're aware of while you're identifying that your area of interest, as well as building a strong rationale for that area of interest. Now, the issue of ethics will come in. So when I say ethics, this is the system of standards guiding your organization. Now, the policies or the principles guiding your organization will certainly have an influence on how your work-based project is undertaken. Therefore, as I've stated on the slide, a good understanding of the principles associated with the different individuals, the different stakeholders, the different teams within the organization, your organization, and being aware of the ethical risk right from the onset. You don't want anything taking you unawares. So being aware of the ethical risks right from the onset of your project process is important. Remember, we're still in the first stage of the work-based project, the define stage or the initiation stage. Now, this is the last element within that stage, the success strategies. Now, someone could be asking me, why would I be thinking about the success strategies at the beginning? You've got to. If, for example, you say to me, oh, Chinny, I want to do this for you, I'm going to be questioning, so what's the benefit of you doing that for me? So which means you've got to think right ahead of the game, what the success strategies of your area of interest are. And to help you do that, I've put these in form of questions. So this is where you take into consideration, as an organization, you take into consideration the user or the client requirements. Have you made your project goal clear? Have you made it clear in such a way that the objectives associated with your project are measurable? So you can measure that you have actually achieved each of the projects or targets associated with the project. This is also where you clearly define, so the success strategies also entails clearly defining your measurement indicators, your monitoring strategies. I'm going to pick up on the evaluation indicators or monitoring strategies in the last stage of the work-based project. So to summarize this section, what are the clear-cut intended benefits of your project to your organization? The second stage of the work-based project is the design stage. This stage of the project, I'll call it the bedrock really, because this is where a lot of planning takes place. Now, I've got 4 things I'm going to discuss under this stage. You, the project leader or the project manager. I would also touch on the different variables that could be associated with your project. Because you're going to be undertaking a project, skills have a part to play. So I'll show us, skills I would expect you to have or possibly develop in conducting your work-based project. And I will also highlight a number of relevant tools and techniques, some of which you should already be familiar with. As the project manager or the project lead, there are vital things that you've got to get in place. So what I've tried to do on this slide is to highlight things that you should have nicely set up as a project lead. The first one is defining the scope of the project. So you've got to know with clarity the boundaries associated with your project. So let's say, for example, someone suggests something about the project. The suggestion might be great, but it might be outside the scope of your project. However, if you're not aware, if you haven't quite defined the significant aspects or the key elements or the boundary around your project, it will be difficult for you to know what is suitable or what is not suitable. So defining the scope of your project. Now, this could be those measurable objectives that I said earlier. So the objectives of your area of focus, or the objectives of your project, have got to be things that you can clearly and should clearly measure. The second point there is scheduling timing. Now, because you have already defined clear objectives, there should be timing associated with the individual objectives. Okay, so you should, a project is not an endless endeavor. A task you have within an organization is not timeless. So there's got to be timing elements associated with the different objectives that you have defined for your project. And this has got to be clear. Now, knowing the timing would help you also manage the entire timing of the project, which I'll come back to a little later. The third point is about the cost. In my definition of what a work-based project earlier, I said that a work-based project is an endeavor or a task that you undertake within a specified budget. So because your project is within the context of an organization, the costing elements associated with that project, the budget that may be required for the purpose of executing that project, has got to be clear. Okay, so there might be estimates here and there, but you've got to clearly define the different, and I've got resources there, the different resources, the different tools or equipment that you may use, and the cost that may be associated with those different resources that you may require for the project, which nicely links me to my third bullet point about aligning the resources. So you have identified the different tools or techniques, or the people that might be involved, the equipment, the apparatus, the systems that might be required for the purpose of your project. Now begin to make those connections. How do they connect to each other? If there are people that you will require for the purpose of executing the project, being aware that there might be disagreements, and how you plan to manage whatever conflict that may arise has got to be something that you have a plan for as a project lead. The final bullet point there is communication. Now, you've got to also have a plan in place as part of your role as a project lead in terms of how you intend to communicate with the different people that may be involved for the purpose of the project, or people that you may need to interact with. This could be the client, this could be individuals, this could be different teams. So there's got to be a plan in place on how you intend to communicate with the different individuals that will have some direct or indirect link to your project. Right, we're still within the second phase or stage of the work-based project, which is the design stage. The first thing we've just talked about is the project manager or the project lead, and that's you. The second point within this design stage are the project variables. What I've tried to do with this slide is to categorize them into defined and undefined variables. Now, defined variables are the elements that you have a good level of control over. Now, you may have already noticed that the things that I've got under defined variables sort of tally with the things I had on the previous slide in terms of defining your role, things you've got to have in place as the project lead. So we've got the scope there, the timing, the costing element, and the resources. Okay, so we said earlier in the previous slide in terms of your role as a project lead that these are things that you've got to get clear. You've got to clearly elaborate the scope of the project, the timing that will be required to complete the task. Okay, the cost, the different costing elements that are associated with the resources for your project. So you have some level of control over those four things I've got under defined variable. It's a different ballgame when it comes to undefined variables. Now, the reason why I have undefined variables here is for you to be aware that there are certain things that you may not have control over. but knowing that there are certain variables that you don't have control over, but knowing them is essential. So change, there are certain things we can't, you start a project and certain things happen. Knowing that certain things could happen could mean that you've already put measures in place to help you address that. I'll pick up on risk, a little later. Now, stakeholders are about the people. You do have control how, to some degree, how you behave or how you execute a project, but not necessarily, the people that will be involved in your project, but you don't necessarily have absolute control on how they may execute their different tasks, that you allocate to them. So being aware that there is some degree of control you have in terms of the stakeholder helps you to manage whatever challenges that could occur. And I think environment is quite clear. So there are certain things in terms of environmental factors that could arise that you don't have control over. But an awareness of this as a variable or as an element within the context of your project is something to take note of. Now, in terms of skills, still within the design phase or stage of the project, I've listed a number of skills on the slide, many, if not all, of which are very familiar skills. Now, the point of this slide is for you to evaluate yourself, so to speak, and identify which of these skills are you competent, in. And are there certain skills I've got on the slide, or maybe may not have mentioned, that you feel that is necessary for the purpose of executing your project, but you haven't quite got them? Do you need to develop those skills? Have you got someone within your team that is good in terms of data analysis? If you're going to have to do some form of quantitative data analysis, why don't you bring them into the project as part of a team member within the project? So it's knowing the skills that you need, knowing the skills you need to develop, and knowing who to bring in who has got certain skills that will help for the purpose of executing the project. Right, here I've listed a number of tools that you may want to consider for the purpose of undertaking your work-based project, and for what purpose. For example, to communicate with different stakeholders or individuals, different teams within your organization at different stages of the project, what tool or tools do you require? For gathering, identifying user requirements, what tool or tools do you require? Now, I'm guessing that you are already familiar with a number of the tools that I've got on the slide. So this is a question of what tools do you need and for what purpose. The third phase or stage of the work-based project is the delegate or delegation stage. Now, in the first two stages, the define and the design stage, you would have known what your project is about in terms of the goal and the objectives. You would have also identified and planned out the different resources that you need in terms of the tools, the techniques, the people that might be involved, and also the skills you require for the purpose of executing the project. The delegation stage is where you start to do some work, as well as where you get people to do some work, which is why it's called the execution stage. You see, I hope your project is so big that it will be difficult for you to manage it on your own, which means you need to engage and collaborate with people, with individuals, with stakeholders for the purpose of driving your project goal. There are three things I will cover in this stage: the project team, stakeholder integration, and the project risk. So having now identified who your stakeholders could possibly be for the purpose of executing your project in the design stage, within the delegate or delegation stage, you want to ensure that your different stakeholders are adequately integrated. And to explain that, I'm going to use a popular tool known as the stakeholder analysis that I've got shown on the slide. Now, this particular framework showcases four categories of stakeholders. The key players, which are individuals or stakeholders that have got a high influence on the project and a high interest. Potential change agents have got high influence and low interest. Indifferent individuals or stakeholders would usually have a low influence on your project and a low interest. While people receiving a service are stakeholders that have got a high interest on the project but a low influence. So let's say, for example, executing a project that's got something to do with creating a satisfying learning experience for a certain category of students. My potential change agents, so individuals that would have a high influence on that particular project or task, would be the higher education quality assurance body. So they have a high influence in terms of they've got a say with respect to the indicators or parameters I put in place for the purpose of designing maybe a program or support mechanism for the purpose of creating that satisfying learning experience for the certain category of students. The quality assurance, higher education quality assurance body may not necessarily have a high interest, but they've got a high influence. So I follow what you might call the standards of policies of the quality assurance agency in putting together my program or support mechanisms. Key players, these are stakeholders that have got high influence and high interest, would be the vice chancellor of my institution and would also be the students within the particular school or faculty where the project is based. Okay, so the students, for example, if I'm based within if my intention is to create a satisfying learning experience for business students, so the business students within my university will have a high influence because I'm taking into consideration their learning needs. They also have a high interest. Indifferent stakeholders for the purpose of my project would be other departments. So let's say, for example, Faculty of Health. So in as much as the Faculty of Health is part of my institution, they do not form part of the business school. They would have some level of influence because they form part of the institution, and they will have an interest because they will want to know what the outcomes of whatever it is that I'm doing. So they have some degree of interest. So it might, at the end of the day, influence their own practice. People receiving a service. So these are stakeholders that's got low influence but a high interest. So this would be other higher education institutions, other universities. The essence of this tool is for you to consider using a tool like this or something similar to this in terms of having identified your stakeholders, is to ensure that you have adequately mapped and integrated the different stakeholders together such that they are not working in isolation. Right, so now having identified the different stakeholders, so you now know who will require for the purpose of executing the project. Remember you planned that out in the design stage. Now the delegation stage is where you question your approach in terms of the different resources of the people, the different stakeholders, and you get them to work as a team. They are not working in isolation, which is where the term team integration has a part to play. How do the different tools or approaches you intend to use, how do they line up with the different individuals that will be required for the purpose of your project, as well as the different colleagues within your workplace context? What coping strategies would you possibly or could you possibly use to bridge any disagreement or divide in the context of executing the project? You're also questioning, could there be implications associated with your putting different individuals together? So the third point within the delegate stage is risk, risk analysis. Risk is anything that might occur that will have some effect on your project. Risk becomes manageable when you have strategies in place, or you've thought about it. We identified risk as one of the undefined variables. So the purpose of this slide is for you to categorize the kind of risk that you're facing. What could have a high impact and low probability of happening? So the point of this framework that I've got on the slide is planning ahead in case something occurs, in terms of the impact of that something that could occur, or as well as the probability of that thing occurring. Right, the final stage of the work-based project is the deliver stage. So this is, where you have an opportunity to evaluate and monitor the outcomes of your project. There are three things I'm going to capture within the stage: the project outcomes, your dissemination or communication strategies, and of course, your measurement and evaluation strategies. Right, it is unlikely that you will finish your project, or you will finish any stage in your project and keep it to yourself. You've got to let people know what you're doing. This is a work-based project after all. So having strategies in place on how to communicate your project output at different stages, it's important. The purpose of any good business case or plan, it's really communication. So you've got to be confident at communicating whatever changes that may occur at the different stages of your project. What plan have you got in place towards communicating your project goal, your project outcomes to the different individuals and stakeholders within your organization? The final point within the final stage of the work-based project, which is the deliver stage, are the measurement, evaluation, and monitoring strategies. If you recall, in the first stage of the work-based project, where we talked about the define stage, and we mentioned the success strategies, I did highlight you've got to have parameters in place, indicators in place on how you plan to measure the outcomes of the project. Okay, so what metrics have you got in place, or what parameters have you set up, performance indicators do you have for the purpose of monitoring your project at different phases, as well as the outcomes of the project? To get you reflect a bit more on this, I've put a number of questions on the slide, and I'll give us a moment to reflect on the questions that I've got on the slide. So essentially, what are you questioning, and what are you willing to settle with? So as I wrap up my session, I urge you to have moments of reflection at the different stages of undertaking your professional or work-based project, to sort of question how much you have achieved both personally and professionally. A second point to take note of, and this should be something that should be at the back of your mind right from the onset of undertaking the project, is questioning where your contribution lies. So as stated on the slide, knowing where your contribution lies is essential to ensure that your organization actually takes steps or makes decisions based on the outcomes of your project. Thank you.